let's start with Kara. Can you put a link to the Mentimeter? We're going to use Mentimeter, which is a presentation and input platform. If you're not familiar with it, hopefully it works pretty smoothly, but Kara's putting a link in the chat right now, and you can click on the link and it should bring you right into our Mentimeter. One of the things that it means if we're working in Mentimeter is that sometimes you're going to want to be looking at me sharing my screen, and sometimes you're going to want to be inputting stuff in Mentimeter. So it does sort of require you to toggle back and forth between two browser windows, or between your Zoom dashboard and your browser window. So anyway, I hope that works out for you, and let us know if you have trouble with that. Today's deep breaths, Christine. Okay. Welcome, Bethany. If you would, yeah, glad to see you.
Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for doing a quick mic check. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Christine Capra, founder of sumApp and developer of Social System Mapping. And I'm going to be one of your hosts today. And the other host is Lisa Negstad, who will be talking with you shortly. And then we have Kara Martner, who is our basically our producer and our tech support person. So if you get stuck with anything, feel free to message Kara and she'll do her best to help you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can, and I just want to, has everybody, has the link been done, and are people in Mentimeter? If you just like twinkle your fingers or nod, great, thanks. Okay, so today we're going to do, in a minute, we're going to do introductions and poll your experience with both social system mapping and human systems dynamics. I'll share with you the sort of vision / theory of change of social system mapping. We're going to put you in some breakouts for a bit to get to know each other. Then we'll come back, review the human systems dynamics theory of change, and then Lisa will introduce the landscape diagram. We'll put you into longer breakouts the second time, same room, so you'll be developing familiarity with one another. And then we'll come back together, do some debriefs and report outs, and hopefully have time for some review and feedback. So in Mentimeter now, if you could share your name, pronouns, location, a network or networks that you're supporting in some way or that you're involved with, and what brings you here today. Just, it's really wonderful to see all of the really valuable work that everybody's engaged in and to get a sense of who one another is. So that is what that's for. Also, just so you know, there's on your Mentimeter, there's a question and answer function. So feel free, if you have questions as we proceed, to put your questions in there, and I will do my best to keep an eye on that. And if I forget, feel free to remind me. And if Mentimeter is just too big a pain for you, feel free to put it into the Zoom channel as well. So another thing I want to say while you're doing that is a social system map is essentially a living map of a community. And if you're not on our social system map, we would really love for you to put yourself on our map. Even if you're only here out of mild curiosity, whatever brings you here, we assume is meaningful. And I bet that there are others in our network who would love to know more about you and who might have other reasons other than social system mapping to connect with you. So to be on our map, Kara's putting an opt-in link into the chat right now. So if you want to go ahead and do that now, you can. But she'll also follow up with all links that she puts in the chat today will be sent to you in a follow-up email tomorrow or the next day. So if you're not into clicking links right now, don't worry about it. Also, if you're on our map and you haven't updated it for a while, which I think is a number of you here, Kara is also putting a link to the Get My Link form so that you can get your own unique URL and go in and update your place on the map. Nicole, you're in Minneapolis, where Lisa and I are, and Kara. Cool. Okay, so that's that. I'm going to move to the next slide now. Well, no, I'm going to pause and look at. So a number of you I know really well, and we have some new people. It's great. Most of us are in the United States this time, but a few Europeans. Okay, so I hope you all had a chance to look at that as well. So social system mapping is our core, what this community practice is essentially about. And a number of you are new names or new faces to me. So I'm guessing that might mean that you don't entirely know what a social system map is or what social system mapping means, and that's just fine. We just want to know how familiar you are, so we have a sense of who's in the space with us and how we need to focus our attention. And so really, wherever you are is perfect. It just helps us to move forward, to know what that is for you. And so it looks like we got 6 people, 7 people responded. Not seeing. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to move forward now. You can still input your information, but I'll be moving to the next slide. I heard a groan. You should be good. Okay. So also, human systems dynamics is, just for those of you for whom it's totally don't know what that means. Human systems dynamics is an institute and a network and a set of practitioners founded by Glenda Ouyang that is essentially a collection of models and methods for thinking about systems thinking in the context of human systems and complexity. And as such, it's, to me, I've been studying systems and complexity for nearly 20 years now, and I find human systems dynamics to be the most accessible and applicable and chunked down to meaningful, useful stuff rather than lots of big abstract stuff. The approach that does that the most that I've found. So I just wanted to, and I'm a social system HSD practitioner. Lisa is an HSD practitioner, and there's a couple other people who are HSD practitioners in the room with us. So I wanted to just see where everyone is at, how much you are familiar with HSD. And I see we've got someone who's not even sure what we're talking about. We've got a handful of people with a rough idea, and then some more experienced people. So we will touch on all of that and help you get a little bit more familiar as we go. So social system mapping, as our introduction, is essentially about systemic transformation. It's about supporting a global movement of people working, and I assume that all of you are part of this movement in one way or another, you wouldn't be here, working to shift from systems of dominance and exploitation and extraction to systems of connection and reverence and regeneration. And we recognize that the foundational, so systemic transformation requires strong networks of change agents. So we recognize that the foundational structure of this global scale systemic shift is strong networks of wise change agents. And networks are the most natural and ubiquitous structures in the world. So you'd think that it would come naturally for us to enact change through collaborative networks. But what we've learned in the last decade or so of this work is that actually social change networks are really challenging. And many people believe that the reason that large-scale systemic transformation is so hard, and therefore the reason that collaborative networks can be so challenging, is due to 2 essential fundamental worldviews that are simply ground into our modern, especially our Western culture. So these worldviews are really so deep that we're generally not even aware of them, but they inform everything we do. Now, that might not be true for those of us in this room, and people you're close to might have some sense of this or a big sense of this, but in general, for most people, this is true, that we're not really noticing how these worldviews impact our work. And so these 2 worldviews are the separate self worldview, which is this idea that everyone has to look out for themselves, that human nature is just simply dog eat dog, survival of the fittest, no connection to the planet or to any other life forms. And there's just nothing that we can do about that because that's just how we're built. That's just human nature. We have to live with it. We just have to take care of our own survival and leave others to fend for themselves. So that's the separate self worldview. And it really shows up when you really pay attention, you can see how it shows up everywhere. Then there's the other worldview is the linear mechanistic understanding of how change happens. So the networks that we're trying to work with and the systems that we're trying to change are what we call complex adaptive systems. They're unpredictable, they have a life of their own, they're just too complex for command and control approaches. And yet we continuously try to deal with them as if they were something like a household appliance. You know, you just flip a switch and the change is going to happen. And that approach just generally makes things much worse. So we believe that social system mapping can help us address both of those mindsets, not just by its mere existence, but when it's done well and when it's really used. So it can help, it can help us both see differently, and it can reshape our thinking as well as our actions. And part of the reason for that is that the visual dimension helps us understand relational dynamics better. Social relationships generally aren't visible, and except at a really small scale where I can see that you two are good friends or whatever. But and there's if we can't see them, there's this visual component to cognition, so that when we're actually able to begin to see the relationships and understand and see the patterns of the relationships that are going on in our networks, then that can really impact our appreciation and understanding of them and help us generate stronger and more mutually supportive and more strategic relationships. We believe that social system mapping also supports deeper understanding of change in complex adaptive systems, because it can be, in its own nature is to be complex. And in that sense, it becomes a sort of a tool for teaching about complexity and seeing patterns and learning how to intervene with patterns in a context that's meaningful and relevant to the actual people in the network. So this isn't like an exercise of a hypothetical. It's like, this is about us. And so that, and it can inform wiser action that we can actually take because it's about us. And it can help everyone in the network manage better in volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous circumstances. So that's the social system mapping sort of theory of change and vision. And I'm going to pause there, and we're going to put you into breakouts for about 6 minutes. Now, the one thing I want to say is your breakouts will be designed so that there's someone who in each breakout room that knows social system mapping fairly well and knows HSD at least enough to talk about it. And so for those of you who are brand new to this, lean on those people. Don't feel like they're smarter than you. They're not smarter than you. They've just had a little bit different kind of path than you to this point right now. And one of the reasons they're here is because they're learning how to help other people understand this stuff, because they're mappers and they're eager to meet new people and have this opportunity. So take advantage of them. Okay, Kara, I'm going to stop sharing. Oh, and then for the breakouts, I just want you to introduce yourselves briefly and just let each other know what your level of experience with social system mapping and human systems dynamics are, so that you know who should lean on who, or who needs to pay more attention and help who in the group. Kara, you ready to break them up? Great, thanks. And we'll bring you back in 6 minutes. Welcome, Michelle, if you want to just do a quick hello mic check, if you want to. Okay, hi, see it in the chat. Okay, I know that was probably quicker than you wanted it to be. That's how these things always are, unfortunately, but because we're always pressed for time, unfortunately. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, and if I can. Okay, we're going to do a quick, brief video of Glenda. This is Glenda Ouyang, who is the founder of Human Systems Dynamics, and this is a quick couple-minute video of her explaining.
You had also mentioned complex adaptive systems a little earlier. Can you explain the concept of that and how that?
Can everybody hear okay? Okay, so Glenda explaining complex adaptive systems.
Again, fits into adaptive action.
Yes. So one of the threads that feeds into human systems dynamics is a history of systems sciences and systems thinking. So in the US, people tend to think about one particular kind of systems language, systems dynamics modeling. But around the world, other people use many other ways to think and talk about systems. The one that we find to be most useful with human systems is called complex adaptive systems. And a complex adaptive system is a collection of agents. They may be people, or they may be businesses, or they may be ideas that interact with each other. And as they interact, a pattern shows up. And once the pattern is there, it influences how the agents behave in the future. Let me give you if you think about culture in this way, you can see that culture, individuals and procedures and policies and histories and traditions and identities and customers, all of them interacting. And over time, a pattern shows up that we would recognize as culture. And once that institutional culture begins to form, it constrains how people are going to behave in the future. So when some new employee comes in, it doesn't take them long to fall into the patterns that are culture in a place, and then they reinforce that. If an employee comes who doesn't fit the culture, it's very hard for them to feel comfortable in the cycle of this complex adaptive process. So complex adaptive system is a collection of agents that interact in unpredictable ways, create patterns that influence how the system acts in the future. One of the most important things about complex adaptive systems in human systems is that they work at all the different levels where people interact. So I can think about the complex adaptive systems inside myself. Physically, my cells act together to create organs, and my organs together to create systems, and the system teams. You can think about a high-performing team as a pattern that emerges, or an organization, or an industry. We do lots of work with national patterns of conflict or oppression, or the kinds of relationships that political structures take as emergent patterns from interactions of agents. So you can find one way to think about things that works across many different contexts and levels. So that's a complex adaptive system.
Okay. So sorry about that. I wanted to pour myself some tea and I didn't want to make noise, and I forgot that muting would mute the video. It shouldn't do that, but it did. So apologies for that. Okay, so I just want to say I love this quote by Paulo Freire: "Liberation is a praxis, the action and reflection of men and women upon their world in order to transform it," because this perfectly describes the ways that we need to understand complex adaptive systems. There's this ongoing back and forth between action and reflection. And because these worldviews that we're talking about shifting from, none of these ways of thinking that stem from those two fundamental mindsets is going to go away overnight. It's not like we hear the topic and suddenly, you know, that switch has been flipped and now our minds are different and we know how to act within this new understanding. No, it's more like a piano practice or a basketball practice or a meditation practice. We need to come back to it over and over. And so not only is liberation a praxis, but so is social system mapping, and so is using human systems dynamics. So this is the system, the actors interacting, and the patterns getting generated. And so the question is, how do we intervene in those patterns? Once they're set, how do we shift them? And so this is really quick view of the human systems dynamics theory of change, which is we've got this system. Adaptive action is how we, is the praxis of reflection and action, and it's also how we intervene with the system. So we start with looking at the patterns, looking at the data, the facts, at what we know. So we're looking at the system, and then in the so what phase, we make inferences about the patterns, or we think about our interpretations of the patterns. And in that phase, it's often really helpful to have some kinds of models or methods or frameworks that can help us reflect and think about what we're seeing differently, because of our mental habits. We need sometimes things that will help us think differently. And so that's where the HSD models and methods comes in. It's also where a social system map comes in, because it also is a model of a system and in which we can see patterns. So a social system map is the best model we have for looking at relational patterns among human beings at the scale of change networks. Then once we've explored the patterns, then we figure out what's one small step that I can take that's in my control, or that's within our collective control within a network, to shift the pattern. So we act. So now what is the action step? And then we act, and then we watch to see what happens, how the pattern has shifted. Has it gotten more in the direction we want it to go, or less in the direction that we want it to go? And then we do the whole cycle all over again. So that's how social system mapping fits with human systems dynamics, fits with systemic transformation. And the thing that I'm really trying to drive home is that it's a practice. And a map won't do anything for you if you don't find ways of encouraging everyone to keep it up to date and to use it and encourage everyone else to use it often. So that's that bit. And now I'm going to, Lisa is going to introduce you to one of the HSD models and methods that we've been finding really helpful in thinking about our own community. And she's going to talk about some of the ways that a social system map of a network that she's been working with was able to use this landscape diagram to make some shifts in their network. Lisa, I'll stop sharing. Tell me when to go back to sharing the slides when you're ready. Handing it over.
Great, thanks. I'll do a little setup and then we'll go right back to them. Hi, everybody. I'm Lisa Negstead, and I know a lot of you. It's great to see all of you. I am a practitioner of both social system mapping and HSD. And I've been lately really loving the method of the landscape diagram. It's one of the HSD methods that we use to help understand a complex adaptive system. It was originally developed by Ralph Stacey. And then now in the HSD work, we've been using it. And I found it especially helpful for a network. And so I want to do two layers of introducing you to the landscape diagram. The first layer, I'm just going to show you the diagram and explain how it's laid out. And then the second round I want to do with it is just explain a little bit how I've used it to think about a network I've been involved with for about 7 years. And then we'll give you a chance to kind of play with it and think about it in the context of your own networks. So let's go to the slides, Christine, and I'll just prompt you as we go through. We're going to look at this. We're going to build as we talk through this, the landscape diagram. So please go to the next one. So the first part of the diagram, the x-axis, is the amount of certainty we know. So this can be for anything, right? So this can be for the amount of certainty that we know what the outcome of a project is going to be. In general, it's about the certainty that we have about the future and how much we're able to predict the future. And we know the further along we move the axis along the x-axis, the less we know about the future. And so there's a little bit of a thing your brain needs to do with this model, is actually the higher the certainty is, the more you're at the left corner. And the less certainty we have about the outcome, the more you're on the right of the x-axis. But so the outcome could be of anything, any action we take, and what that's actually going to result in an outcome. And as we know in complexity, it's very hard to predict that. So that's moving us to the far right. So let's look at the next slide, which adds in the y-axis. And this is about the level of agreement we have together. So this can be our team. This can be a network of individuals. It can be a network of organizations. It can be any collection. And it can be within yourself. This is the scales. Remember, you heard just on Glenda's video about this happens at all different levels. So you can even map your own internal reactions on the landscape diagram. I'm having you focus on the network for today. So this is about the amount of agreement you have in your network about what you should do, the amount of agreement you have about the actions you should take in your network. And again, it works such that the closer to the corner is the more agreement you have, the more alignment you have about what actions you should take. And the further you are, you're going up the y-axis. So those two axes work, and then you put them together and you have different parts of the diagram that are starting to describe the kind of action that can happen in there. So we have the stable part of that diagram where we're closest to certainty. We're able to predict what's going to happen, and we have a lot of alignment and agreement. And that stable corner of the diagram is where we can do things like have procedures. We can have some set ways we do things. Other examples here are things like that can kind of be, mechanical things that we can do. It's the organized world here in this left hand of the corner, right? A budget is an example. Sometimes a budget can get into emergent if you can't predict certain things like income. So that the budget might be in both places. I'd actually put accounting in the stable, and I'd put budget in emergent, which we're going to talk about next, but this is great. So we have stable. It's very constrained and predictable. And then the thing that's really interesting here too, as we look at the diagram, is what it's governed by. What kind of things let us kind of govern it or kind of direct what happens in there. And those are, in this corner of the diagram, it's governed by rules, procedures, policies, and processes, right? Because we can predict the outcome. So we can put traditional planning, we can put in this corner of the landscape diagram. So let's go to the next layer here. And when we move out a little bit with ability to predict, and we move up the y-axis where we have less agreement, and in other words, we might have more difference, we might have more diversity in our network that we're having to navigate. And this is the emergent space, right? So this is where we have emergence, and it means we're doing different things here. So here's where we are looking for the patterns. This is where we're trying to identify patterns. This is the adaptive world. This is the world that we've been talking about in these sense-making sessions, right? Where we're doing the adaptive action, where we're trying to assess what we know right now, make meaning of it, and find the next action and then go learn from it, because we can't predict outcome as well. It's where change doesn't happen in this linear cause-effect way. So this area is governed by agreeing on principles. In the human systems dynamics world, we call them simple rules, and we look for simple rules sometimes. And you can be overt about creating those simple rules that you're trying to have, but they're also already part of the patterns that you have in the emergent space. So it's governed. It's often you can't create procedures, you can't solve a problem because you can't predict the outcome. The certainty part of that line is further out. So what we need to do is figure out, well, then at least let's agree on the principles we have about our work. And then we go out to the farther side, the farther we go out on the landscape diagram, we're entering the unstable space. This is that space that feels totally random. There's no ability to predict what's going to happen. This is really where surprise happens. So we can pay attention to that surprise and then maybe notice and move it into emergent and start to see patterns. But in the unstable corner, it feels very, very, it's chaos, right? And thanks for, everybody just keep adding. I love how you're adding into the examples, and I really invite that as we talk about the landscape diagram. One little example here is just, as we think about when the coronavirus was emerging, we were unstable, right? We just was sort of all this like surprise and randomness happening. I feel like now when the place we are is more emergent, with the COVID-19. We have a lot more data. We've been having a lot more studies. We have now vaccines. We're in the emergent space. We're still not, I mean, there's parts that's still in the stable. And when you take any kind of example, any example of something, a pandemic down to a small project is going to have pieces of all of this, right? It's going to have pieces of the stable, emergent, and unstable. So let me just take a minute here before we give you a chance to kind of play with it as you think about your own network. I'm going to show you how I kind of thought about it for a network I was part of. So in that network, it's a network of organizations in Southeast Asia that work on environmental activism and conservation. And so that it's a wide network. It's across several countries. And I think there's an interesting thing. There's a time piece to kind of think about in the establishment of a network. When we first started, we started with the one stable thing we had was one meeting where we had some of the funders and some of the implementers in this kind of work come together and ask if there is a there there. Like, would it be valuable for us to meet more regularly? And what would that look like? Can we actually, should we share learning? Can we actually share some common purpose of some kind of goals that we're working on? And so that was part of that network, is like most of it was unstable, but we had this one meeting to really talk together about what might happen. But 6.5 years later, I want to take you to where we are now as we think about our network on this landscape diagram. So right now, our stable aspects right now is we have regular places that we connect as a network. We have regular monthly calls with learning presentations. We have an annual longer conference that happens. We have some staff roles. We have 2 part-time staff roles that support the staff roles and how they relate to the network, and the kind of a governing committee that's part of the network. We have security protocols, because it's very important given the context. And right now that's more an emergent, because we're realizing we have to even have more strict security protocols because of the context they're in. So we're in the emergence right now, trying to figure out what the patterns are and where we can be stable with that and where we have to keep adapting. We have a social system map that has all these different 3 features actually on the landscape diagram. But the fact that we have a map that gets updated that people use is in the stable part of the diagram. In emergence right now, we're also really looking at patterns of participation. Like, we're noticing where there's energy in the network for coming together and doing shared learning, but we're also feeling like there's some decrease of energy in a network. And we're trying to figure out what that means and what can we test in engagement, especially test and engagement when we've had this COVID pandemic and we've had to do everything on a Zoom versus meeting in person once a year at least, and what can we do? So there's that's emerging. And as I shift into that emergent space, we always are having this pattern question around, we have so much difference in the network, which is one of the great things about bringing it together. We have people who are, from very traditional international NGOs working on environment, but we also have people on the ground doing really even dangerous environmental activism. And we have this wide range. So then how do we, could we actually come together on a shared strategy or not? So that's a question that we're in emergence right now, right? Shared learning, great, but actually doing an action together as the full network, is that a possibility? Or maybe it's not a possibility. And there's just sort of challenges and opportunities. This is emergent spaces, and the landscape diagram is a really good place to look at challenges and opportunities. And we decided to use the social system map to try to assess that even more. What are the challenges and opportunities that each organization in the network is facing, and is there some more overlap? And so we use the social system map to help us with that emergent space. And in the unstable space, a lot of it is big contextual forces, right? So governments that are shrinking political space and getting even better at monitoring things in a way that's very threatening to what's trying to happen. Big forces of economic development, international forces of economic development combining with land grabbing, environmental degradation, like just these huge forces that feel really unpredictable, and things like the COP conference this week on climate change and what that's going to do to this. There's just a lot there. Okay, so I'm going to stop because I'm not even sure where I'm supposed to be on time, but there might be a few questions. We could take them in the chat. We could ask. Let me just check in with Christine about how we're doing on time. Should we just jump to the breakouts, or should we do some questions?
I'm not sure where you were going to be on time at this point, but it's a quarter to the top of the hour, so we've got another 45 minutes left, and we wanted to have breakouts for 20.
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes. If there's any questions right now, let's take some.
Lisa, just a silly question here, I think. So on the diagram, it sort of does this flow kind of slide thing. I assume that's just an aesthetic and there's not some like strange peak or dip inherent there. It could just be like a half circle.
Right. My understanding is it's just trying to show that on that border, you have kind of a mix. Yeah, go ahead, Christine.
So I had I was talking with Glenda one day, and I was saying how I liked Dave Snowden's Canavan model because it had those, because it made it clear that that was a phase shift. So there is a difference. There is a qualitative difference from one space to the other, and it's not just sort of a continuum, of incremental shift. And so I was saying that to Glenda, and she said, well, that's why we have those lines in there. That's meant to indicate a phase shift. So, but she doesn't, I've never heard her say that in a group, but when I pressed her directly, she said that's what that was.
And it kind of depends. I've seen a model where the Canavan model is put on this.
Yeah.
And as you work up, like that space between stable and emergent on the y-axis,
yeah,
and the space between stable and emergent on the x-axis is actually complicated.
Yeah.
If you're familiar with the Canavan model, we're kind of getting into that wonkiness, but yeah.
Yeah. Jim.
It just occurs to me as you were talking, Lisa, that all of these elements, stability, emergence, and instability, are happening simultaneously in different parts of your landscape. And I had not been thinking about that quite the same way, but of course, it makes sense.
Yep. It's the fractal view of complexity when we're in a quantum view of the world. It's all just this fractal view. It just keeps, I don't even know how to, you just described it very well, but that's the fractal view of it. And any one thing, you have all these layers of it.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I do have a question. Lisa, you said when you're in the emergent phase, there's challenges and opportunities, and you can test the engagement in that space. What are like some of the ways that's done, or just an example?
So one thing to do is just to ask the network, like right now in the next quarter, what's your biggest challenge and what's your biggest opportunity? And then what you can do is see where where there's alignment around that. So when we asked the Southeast Asian network about challenges and opportunities, there was a lot around the COVID, but then there was some around like this next layer of China. I mean, this is just a specific example, but China is now they are selling their internet surveillance to the countries of Southeast Asia, and they're going to be able to get into even end-to-end encrypted meetings. And so what are we going to do about that? And the fact that you see that there is organizations from all the different countries having that same challenge. Okay, can we come together and do some brainstorming? Can we look to other options here? What can we learn together about it? So it starts with the inquiry about challenges and opportunities, or of what people are seeing, and then a kind of a facilitated dialogue around that. And then there might be something that moves into stable, like we're actually having a group that meets. We're not doing this. This is just me giving an example of what could happen, is that we have a group meet that comes around that and tries to find, and then would present back to a network meeting maybe once a month to share what they're learning.
Can Lee, sorry, go ahead. Lisa, go ahead. Lee.
I see Lee's hand is raised. Yeah, why don't you go, and then Christine.
I so rarely get to use the raise hand function here. So, I mean, I understand the landscape map there, are you actually plotting things on it? Like we were using the budget example. Would you have like a dot that is budget somewhere on there? Or is it more conceptual to say somewhere the budget is stable or emergent, or the accounting is stable? Or would you put accounting as a dot somewhere in that shape?
Yeah, so that is one great way to use it, but there's no one right way. You know, it can be just conceptually, but a lot of times it can be helpful for groups to take like post-it notes. And if there's something in front of them, right? So you're kind of defining, what is this in front of us? What kind of, maybe it's a project, or maybe it is the budget. Like we're trying to figure out what part of the budget can we get more control of and what part is really out of our control. And you could take post-it notes and put it on different parts of the landscape diagram, but then it also shows you the difference in the room, like, and it can show you how much agreement you have or not. So there's like kind of endless ways to use it. And I'm looking for the other HSD practitioners in the room to say if you have any other thoughts to that question before we maybe move to Michelle's.
This is Joe. One of the things that is very important in HSD is to consider the container. And a container is the context. And that determines what you are playing with in context of complexity. And how that influences the other relationships or interchanges is what we use the language with the other entities or other aspects of the system. So yes, budget could be plotted, but like how does budget inform other decisions? So that needs to be brought into the context. So you are looking at complexity at a zoomed in and also in a container, as if you're putting boundaries to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Ish.
Lisa, I wanted
Thank
to
you, Joe.
throw in another
Go ahead.
example. I wanted to just give us an example that applies to this particular group. So I've been doing a lot of thinking about what would be more like how we could generate more energy and more self-organizing in this community of practice. And as I was working with the landscape diagram, what I realized is we have this very stable place, which is these Monday morning meetings, which are very stable, and they're also relatively rigid in terms of I decide who, what happens. And so they're very super stable and anybody can come to them. And then we had this emergent space, which was sort of a group of people who I talk to regularly first, whatever, because they've approached me with questions and we've developed a relationship. And so we're sort of always sort of having this very bubbly, fermenty, creative conversations, but those conversations never really turn into anything because, and what I realized was that there isn't like a pathway from stable to emergent. There isn't a way for new people to sort of step into the emergent space and find their own place in that space, so that we never really generate enough people who are having these creative ideas to work together and to start creating self-organizing. So I realized that we need so the people who are very into emergence and messiness and being very creative, I need to sort of drag them back, and that some of them are here and they don't like sort of drag us into, okay, but we need some stable on-ramp. We need some pathways in so that we can have more, like the phase change was profound. It was just like there's a huge gap, and I was the only way to go from that stable place into the emergent place, and I didn't have the energy to keep helping people into it. So we're working on that, and that's one way that the landscape diagram helped me understand certain dynamics about the way I'm leading in this context and the way we're all able to show up in this context, because there wasn't enough of that connection between the different parts of the diagram. And I know one person, Lisa, I'll stop. I just need to interject that.
Yeah, thank you. I think Michelle had a question, and then I think maybe we should go to the next step.
Yeah.
Michelle, did you still? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, my question was on, to what extent do you explain that landscape diagram to partners? And what do you do? My second part of the question is, what do you do when they want to get on the same page, but the work isn't there, or they want to work on clear outcomes, but they're just not there yet?
Anybody have a thought on that? I haven't actually shown the landscape diagram to that network I was talking about. I was using it more as a staff position to kind of help understand and then use it to think of questions. And for leaders, it can be really helpful to kind of map where, whatever the container is, right? If it's some big project that's really stuck, you feel like, or you're running into something, it can be useful to kind of map it to then determine where to do the leadership, but like what questions you then might ask back to the network. So for me, it always goes back to the inquiry and what might be the questions you test with the network to see where you can get that engagement. You know, what's one thing you can try with them? But I'm curious if others have ideas or thoughts about that, about how to answer. It's a really good question.
For me, in practice, what I do is I start with, so you study the fractal, you create the boundary conditions or the container, and then you move into interdependent pairs. And of those interdependent pairs, which ones influence the decision making will move into the landscape diagram, because that's where we need to see how the data is flowing or influencing the systems at hand. Does that make, and interdependent pairs are like the paradoxical elements that, you know, there's no right way, wrong way. It's just here or there, it sits on a scale. And then you choose which ones are prominent, which ones are alive right now in the system that we are sensing in, and then take them out into the context of landscape diagram and map it out. And it, as even, you know, one of the things that Hsd influences is this experimental attitude. Is like, okay, we're going to try this and see how the system is. So the probing, before the probing is the inquiry in systems thinking. So inquiry, probing, sensing, sense making, acting. So that those are, does that help, Michelle? Thanks.
So I just want to throw I think that it really depends on the context. And if people don't even understand this stable, emergent, unstable stuff, it can be a really good conversation just to like have them pick a thing, have them put Post-its on the thing. That can open up a lot of awareness that everything is unstable. Some people just live unstable, expect everything to be unstable and push towards stable. And just having the landscape diagram and talking them through it, and then talking about where are we with our project, or what parts are stable, or, you know, just the whole overall situation. So it depends. In other words, it depends on the context and what you need and how you use it. Can be any way.
I think, you know, we have some questions for you that we use in an adaptive action way on the landscape diagram to kind of keep playing around, thinking about how you might use this with your network. And so maybe, let's see, are those questions on a slide, Christine? Can we just review those? Oh, you want to do the cognitive load first?
Let's just, should we just move into the discussion points? That's fine.
I think we should, yeah.
Am I still sharing my screen?
No.
Okay, so you need to see the discussion points. Is that it?
Yes, please.
Okay. There we go. Okay.
So we're thinking we'll go into smaller groups again and breakouts to just play with this landscape diagram a bit. So the questions we have for you are, what are the factors that are stable or that lend stability to your network? What are the emerging patterns that you're seeing in your network? And what factors might be making it unstable right now, where you're just not able to predict anything? And then where is the biggest opportunity and risk right now for your network? So those first questions are what questions in adaptive action, and you don't want to go to that last question of, so where is the biggest opportunity and risk, until you kind of think through those first questions. So they're in order for a reason, and maybe you can decide if you just want to pick one network that you're willing to kind of all dive into and practice, or maybe you want to each kind of think through these questions in your own network. It's kind of up to the group how you want to manage this. And we were going to have 20 minutes, but I'm wondering if we should go to 15, just so we have some time for debrief on the way back. So we'll do 15 minutes. That's okay, Kara.
Lisa or Kara, can you guys just share that to the breakout rooms? That slide?
Yeah.
If you can just put them in the chat.
I'll just put them in the chat. Yep,
Okay.
I got them right here. So I'll just put them in the chat.
I just put them in the chat, and I'll put them in after your email.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So in other words, we can go ahead and is everybody ready for breakouts? Okay, Go ahead, Kara. Thanks. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had wonderful conversations, got to know each other a little bit, and got a little bit of usefulness out of this method. We're going to go ahead, and Lisa's going to lead a debrief and report outs. But I also Lisa is putting links to more HSD resources in the chat. And in Mentimeter, I'm not going to take us back to Mentimeter now. I'm just going to let Lisa wrap us up. But if you would be so good as to just go into Mentimeter, it now will move forward at your pace, and just input what you're learning, what you're seeing, and give us some feedback. We'd love that, because it is part of our adaptive action, is to do something, see how it works for people, and then adjust it. So I'm going to ask you to do that, and Lisa will take it away. You ready?
And just Christine, you might want to check to see if it's on the right slide in Mentimeter. I'm just not sure.
It's on the deep. So it should be, though. Now people can move forward on their. Can you guys, if you move forward, can you? Because I just changed the settings. So, okay, Ryan's saying yeah. Okay. So you can move yourselves through the last slides, and Lisa won't be talking about a slide at any point in time, right? Except the learn. I'm at learn more about HSD now, and then I think we're good. Thank you.
Great. So let's just hear. I'd love to hear if there's any insights or reflections that you want to share, or questions after you've had your small group conversation. You can either unmute or just pop it into the chat. And I'm looking here. Just see. I mean, we can open it to any questions about social system mapping or human systems dynamics as well. Anything that we've been talking about today. Anything you'd like to talk about?
I'll just share something from the small group that resonated with me is when you're in those uncomfortable spaces, but you're in a space where you know that change needs to happen, finding some commonalities with shared agreements and guiding principles to keep things, as stable as possible. So that just resonated with me. Thank you.
Oh yeah, that's a great example of that. I know often in that emergent space, yeah, when we're working across a lot of difference, we're in that emergent space. So having something that does feel stable and agreeing to it together also creates that stability for people and more ability to be then in the discomfort when we're doing that. That's great. That's a great example. Thank you. Yeah, Drew.
Yeah, one point about from our conversation is really that a network of any size or complexity and length of time is going to be inherently unstable. Stuff will change, your budgets will change, people will die, so instability is a common characteristic of networks. And that's something we just have to be able to play with. So points will be moving up and down your landscape all the time. And that's what I find fascinating about it is maybe being able to plot a network onto those various landscape areas over time, so you can see how the network moves and changes over the landscape. As I say, I'm going to start playing with that.
Yes, that's a great example. And I find that some of these methods can really help people understand that it is always moving, but that, if we take a point in time and can kind of see where we are in this point of time, it helps people take a breath and not get overwhelmed by things always changing. Well, what can we do? Things are always changing, or things are out of our control, right? In the environment. And so these kinds of methods can help us take a breath and see that, okay, there might be, this might be happening all the time, but we can put something in stable. And I think it can really point to leadership in a network too. Like if there's a lot in unstable, then the leadership at that point is to pick one stable thing and help guide people to that, right? That's one thing we do in leadership that can really help.
Yeah,
Laura?
Yeah, I was also thinking about how the landscape diagram and kind of, you know, applying it in a certain way can help us find, like, where do we need to put our attention and focus? And this relates to what you just said, you know, like, is it like an emergent opportunity that really needs our attention? Is it something that actually creates more stability in a situation that's really unstable? I also observed that many times as things get more emergent and unstable, it's actually harder to find agreement because people have like a million different views then, right? Because we don't know, we don't have a proven concept or a strategy that we know will work. So then when you have like a million different opinions and people have their own agendas, and it can become more difficult to kind of come towards agreement. So that's, I think, one of the things I'm like really playing with, and how we then set like our attention or focus to what's really useful, based on kind of mapping out what is, like within the diagram where a certain project or situation in a network is currently moving.
Yeah, I think that, you know, so you're describing that moving up the y-axis where there's not a lot of agreement, right? There's less and less agreement. That's where I think that simple but powerful adaptive action cycle can be so helpful, because often what you can do is then at least get into the inquiry and figure out the next wise action. And can we just test that? You know, because even people who don't agree, if at least we can just go and test it, and the people who think that's a bad idea are going to learn, or maybe they're convinced. And I just feel like that's such a good, you know, the adaptive action cycle is such a helpful place in that emergent space when we're moving up the disagreement side of it. Yes. Chamath, yeah. And then Sarah, great.
Yeah, Lisa, you mentioned leadership, and that's an enduring interest for me. Does HSD and network weaving, does it help, or does it conceptualize leadership in a different way? Because the standard model of leadership is like very individualistic and hierarchical and, well, frankly, white supremacist. Mm-hmm. So is that part of the conversations you're having, or are those questions arising in your conversations? That's how I would frame the question.
Yeah, leadership is not, I kind of navigate both worlds of hierarchy, which really, perpetuates white supremacy for sure. And leadership as a behavior. And in HSD, we talk about leadership as setting the conditions. Mm-hmm. And it's a real different orientation. You know, we're trained so much as leadership being this formal position of authority in hierarchical structures. So yeah, it's a really important point to stop and describe what we mean by leadership in the context of HSD, and also in network leadership. And I think there's been a lot of thought of that, with even June Hawley's thought about the difference between organizational leadership and network leadership. Yes. So yeah, you see Joe probably put the description too of HSD, but HSD considers leadership as setting the conditions. Anyone can be a leader. It's not just a formal position of a hierarchical structure.
Yeah, that's a very helpful clarifications. I've been using the phrase creating conditions, that a leader creates conditions for participation, and it's my own thinking, but it's been influenced by many others, and I don't claim it to be original, but I find the parallel or the correspondence very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, that's cool. That's really cool. And I even go to co-creation, right? As being like co-creating the condition. I love that. Yeah. Excellent. Sarah, you have your hand raised. I'm also going to watch time here a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things to remember too with all these, like with, all these spaces on the landscape diagram is like, there's really no naughty or nice. It kind of depends on what you really need for your network at that time. So for an example for REAMP is, we asked ourselves, what are emissions in the Midwest, right? Where are emissions coming from in the Midwest? So we did some analysis, and we came to some high agreement and certainty that in the Midwest, we have an outsized impact on agricultural emissions in the country. And so then we asked, okay, well, so what? Like, what are we actually going to do about that? That actually sent us into chaos, because we're like, we don't know shit about agriculture. We got to figure this out. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? So what did we do? We put together a project team to like move us back into this emergent space, to get our arms around like, okay, what are the pathways? And we're hosting a summit with members. and we're going to have good conversation. And from there, we're going to figure out like, where does REAMP really need to focus our time and energy for emissions in agriculture? And that's going to move us back into a stable environment, at least for the next couple of years, until again, we sort of maybe blow it back up and like go through that adaptive action cycle again of what, so what, well, now what, you know, and we'll keep doing that. So it moves between, you know.
That's such a great example. Thank you for using that example and putting on the landscape diagram. It's excellent. Thank you, Sarah. I'm looking at time. We have a few more minutes. Anything? There's a question coming in chat here. This might be a question for Christine coming from Lee here.
Yeah, I think it, so,
And I can take that offline. That's not really part of this discussion. It was just something that popped up. So,
okay. So just to clarify though, for your awareness, when we talk about social system mapping, we're talking about a very explicit set of tools and an explicit methodology, which is Kumu and sumApp. That is not necessarily what you're talking about, but that's kind of the kind of mapping that we're referring to. And I think there's a lot of tools that you could use, 7 Vortex being one. And anyway, yeah, okay. Other, Lisa?
Just seeing if there's any last, I think we're just seeing if there's any last comments or questions, and also inviting you to go to the Mentimeter and fill out the reflection questions at the end.
As well, I think there's a space to fill out what came up for you as well. Like we would like to be capturing the thoughts that you're sharing with us verbally as well in Mentimeter to the degree that's possible. Zach.
Is everybody able to get to that last part? I'm just not able to, but I think it's because I'm not doing something right. So just want to make sure everybody's able to get to that part of the Mentimeter that they need to give us your reflections.
I'm seeing a slight one nod.
Yeah, thanks for putting it again, Kara.
I feel like the next question is a little bit like hidden. Like I kept struggling to find like, where am I moving on? But there is generally a next button.
And Zach, you had a question.
Yeah, this might have came up, but I was curious of what's kind of the cadence of coming back to this map and updating it or reflecting on it. And so you kind of map it out at the beginning of maybe some of your initiatives. And then is this what, Lisa, you're talking about creating some type of routines and rituals around revisiting it and repopulating it as things progress, or what's maybe some of that cadence?
Yeah, and you're talking about the landscape diagram versus a social system map.
Right, landscape.
Yeah. For the landscape diagram, you know, with any of the methods for HSD, it's fit for function, we call it. So it's like when it makes sense. So if the group is really resonating, if you find that network members really, you know, this is a useful tool for them, then it might be one of those tools or methods that you come back to and use. Or it might be one use where it just kind of provides an insight to the network that they hadn't had before. And so just with any of the methods with HSD, they're there and available for when that might be useful. And one of the things we use for landscape diagram that we're thinking about in a network is when you do have a lot of difference, it can be helpful. So if you're noticing a network having a moment where they're kind of sticky issue and you're seeing a wide range of perspective and you're not sure how to bridge that, the landscape diagram can be a useful method for that. Other thoughts? We're kind of at the end. We have 1 minute left, so I think I might turn it over to Christine and just do any last minute wrap up. But I wanted to just say thank you all. It was really fun interacting with all of you today, meeting some of you, getting to see some of you, and I hope you all have a great rest of your week.
Yeah.
Turn it over to Christine.
Thanks. Yeah, I just the same. It was really fun. This was I was excited about this one in particular, just because it's a new tool for us to use related to social system mapping. And so let's go ahead and we have a goodbye ritual that we always engage in these sessions, which is I'll count, we'll all unmute ourselves, everybody who wants to do this with us, you know, it's not don't have to, but I'll count down from 3, 2, 1, and then we'll just all give each other our greetings and our blessings for the rest of our day or evening or whatever it is. And just express our appreciation all at the same time. So if you want to do our goodbye ritual, go ahead and unmute yourself. And 3, 2, 1. Thank you so
well,
much.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Everybody.
Great week.
Bill.
Happy
Thank you,
November.
man.
Great
Thank
week.
you, man.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.